What is evolution? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is evolution? Well, the standard definition says that evolution is inherited traits through successive generations that change the species. And it also goes on to say that there are changes that occur in a being presumably for the better. It's been a topic of debate, inquiry, argument, all sorts of things for a long time, most especially since Charles Darwin came up with his theory of natural selection. And people generally focus on the genetics area, the biological evolution that's present in the world. So let's get into it. We'll start with biological evolution, physical evolution, that was Darwin's main area of focus. And essentially what he was saying was that biological characteristics of species adapt to their environment over time. And his main thing was saying that natural selection occurs in a process of where biological capabilities that match up with the environment act as a sort of filter to which versions of the species get to mate and propagate the genetics down the line and make the species more efficient for operating in its local environment with the natural elements. So, they had the example of, birds of a certain beak length who needed to get to flowers for their sustenance. And over time, birds that had the longer beaks, they could get deeper into the flowers where the nectar was. They passed on their genetics. And the birds with the shorter beaks who couldn't get to the food, they either died or weren't allowed to mate. And over successive generations, the birds with the longer beaks, their genetics were passed on more often, and the ones with the shorter beaks were not. And so shorter beak birds fell out of the genetic makeup of that line of the species of the animal, and we were left with longer beak birds. And when a person comes up to that longer beak bird and they go, oh, this is how they are, Darwin's like, nope. If you look back in the chain of events and you inspect the cause and effect backwards, you'll see that at a certain point there were, in that species, birds of varying bill lengths, and nature sort of selected / filtered them out through time, through generations. And that's sort of the overall theory of biological natural selection evolution. Just character traits matching up with the environment for which survival is dictated, and then essentially the environment filtering out all the traits that are incompatible with continued survival of that species. And then over time, that changes the genetic pool from which that species is breeding. And science has a lot of hard data for that. And, that's sort of like how it goes. Now, philosophically speaking, we get to drill deeper and we say, okay, so there appears to be a pretty strong case for biological evolution in that matter. And then we get to sort of philosophically, since we're humans, let's make this human specific, how does evolution work for humans? Not just on the biological level, because we've sort of through technology and external means taken a lot of the natural selection, if not all of it, out of the equation and replaced it with evolutionary processes which determine whether or not a human's essentially more fit to survive in a man-made system, in a constructed system, an artificial system, than we are open to natural factors. Which, of course, that leads to a whole different area of discussion in regards to evolution. Of okay, now is man, and this is just like on the biological level, has man now taken control of its own evolutionary process based on the fact that we're essentially forcing ourselves to live in a constructed realm, an artificial realm, one that is seemingly apart from nature, which that's an entirely different discussion as to whether or not, to what degree has man removed himself from nature, or to what degree can man remove himself from nature? Is it all a delusion anyway? So, in a way, when we're discussing man's evolution, we're discussing a self-aware being having taken control of the environment to a large degree, or at least convincing himself that he has taken control of the environment to a large degree. And in terms of the idea of natural selection aspect of evolution, of the environment filtering out traits that are incompatible with the continued survival of a species within the environment, man has to a large degree taken control of the natural selection, which of course leads down a path of like many philosophical questions and responsibilities popping up in the world of man, because now that they have removed so many factors from nature from doing what seems to be nature's job according to natural selection and biological evolution, now that makes man responsible, seemingly so, for many of those decisions and for creating systems which end up needing to sort of imitate what's already present in nature and evident in natural selection. And so that line of thought actually leads to all sorts of sort of horrific decisions through history, when man has decided that he is now the Grim Reaper, so to say, and the arbiter of what genetics should continue. And that's essentially the thought process for eugenicists, is that now that man has taken control of its fate, then it's man himself who must make decisions regarding genetic preferences and which characteristics and traits should be preserved throughout the human species. And that's generally been found to be the underpinning philosophy or thought process or methodology for most of the worst crimes against humanity that we have on the books, whether it's outright genocide, concentration camps, ethnic cleansings, wars in general, censorship campaigns, awful medical experimentation, just general attempts to play God, really. But that seems to be that's their underlying thought process. Man's taking control of the natural process, and since now we are gods in nature, have replaced nature with man. It is now man's responsibility to adjudicate and implement these evolutionary processes that are normally in the well-earned hands of nature. So that's sort of the basic idea of evolution as a biological process. But since it's philosophy and we're human beings, we know that we have a rich internal life that's malleable, and we know that evolution in the human species can and does occur within one lifetime. That's well documented. People change. People have had rapid accelerations of evolution across the globe, across race, creed, color, religion, doesn't matter. It's a universal human aspect of the human experience that the inner life of ourselves and our perception and our consciousness is able to be changed by external experiences and by applying our awareness and consciousness to the interaction between our inner life and the external consequences. And in that sense, evolution is one of the chief, or seems to be one of the chief goals of the creation of the human experience, is that the external forces are not just acting on our dumb animal bodies, but they are stimulating our inner life to evolve our perspective and our consciousness. And our actions with the external world are reflected in the interchange. And they are well articulated by mystics, messiahs, prophets, writers, artists throughout history, throughout time. Well articulated that it is a normal process. And in fact, almost to the person, those people who have recorded their inner journey, their main message to other people is that that is chiefly where the best part of the human experience lies. That when a person becomes self-aware, one of the main privileges and responsibilities that a person has come into the position of receiving and taking is that of overwatching their own evolution and becoming aware of their own evolution. And in that sense, any interaction a person comes into is able to be a catalyst or participate in the process of the evolution of the human soul and the human consciousness and the human perception. So evolution in that way is a process of being exposed to the vibratory atmosphere that we call life. And for those parts of which the individual is conscious of interacting with, or even if they're unconscious, I should say, because the unconscious things can evolve us as well. But when we bring those factors into our conscious awareness, then we can figure out why we are the people we are and why the person we are now is different than the person we were backwards in time, and why the person that we're going to be in the future is influenced by the person that we are now, and our awareness of the fact that we are capable of consciously changing and evolving. The idea of the inner evolution being that the continuation and accumulation of our experience in this realm informs and changes us fundamentally, that it's irreversible, that our experiences are incorporated into our essence, into our soul, our consciousness, our perception, and that they do refine us, or they at least give us the opportunity to see that we have the choice to refine ourselves, that we can organize and collate the experiences in such a manner that they become useful to us and that they fuel our continued experience and they become the foundation of ourselves. So in a way, our experiences become the foundation of ourselves. And when we find that this is true, then the evolution becomes the experience. Because then we know that as we continue to exist and the energies flow around us, that merely that act continues the evolution and continues the progress deeper into life and the refinement of who we are, and in turn refines the relationship that we have with life and our ability to have an understanding that it's a natural selection process in which many humans thought that we removed ourselves from the biological aspect. In fact, that was not true. And even if it were, really what it did was it freed us up to go into the more accelerated version of the inner evolution, of the spiritual evolution, of the soul evolution, of consciousness, of perception, And that when we look at biological evolution and we see how many generations it can take millions of years for a physical characteristic to win out in natural selection, in biological evolution, and it's nearly imperceptible as it occurs. We find that in sharp contrast to inner spiritual soul consciousness evolution, it can happen literally overnight. And a human, their soul and consciousness and perception can be radically accelerated in the span of one lifetime in a way which is incomparable to the biological evolution. And we can look, there's so many examples. The human species is basically nothing but examples of this inner evolution. But there are very obvious ones, like a very obvious one is Gandhi, where Gandhi, born regular, normal Indian dude, gets educated, he becomes a British, Western educated lawyer, and then at some point, the spiritual evolution takes off, and he leaves behind that whole world, in fact, to go into the spiritual world in order to point out to people that, like, he sort of figured out that world and that they needed to detach from it and be free of it. And then a spiritual evolution, which is well chronicled, accelerated at a pace that, when you compare it to a pace of a biological evolution, like biological evolutions like this, and then, like over thousands and thousands and thousands of generations of these species of animal, as opposed to Gandhi in one life, who was like here, and then he just goes like straight up into inner spiritual soul consciousness perception evolution, to the point where the vast simple majority of other human beings who've ever even cursory taken a cursory look at his life's trajectory say, oh, that guy, he's on another level of spiritual evolution. Some people might call him a saint or a savior or a mystic or a sage or just a spiritual leader or a yogi or whatever you want to call somebody who's attained a high level of spiritual realization. And that's on display. And that tends to be the resonating message from any human who has gone from a human life and looked inward and found that the key to the version of human evolution is not the development of the physical characteristics for natural selection, but it, for some reason, which is a philosophical topic for another time, that when the gaze has turned inward and the human has realized that in terms of the human experience, the spiritual evolution is really the accessible, malleable form of the experience, then they experience tremendous growth. And that growth is felt. It's not just shared internally. Like in the example of Gandhi, he went through the internal process, and then the shockwaves of just his internal process were felt throughout the world, through time and space. That's how powerful human evolution is. And when we look at examples throughout human history of human beings who have, in this focused look, have gone through extreme spiritual evolutions, they typically have a global impact. They range from all of your typical uh, high level spiritual people that we know about, like Jesus, Yeshua, Muhammad, Vishnu, Buddha, Bob Marley, uh, Gandhi, any of these, any of the spiritual leaders or spiritual people that you can think of. The reason that we can think of them now is because they started off as human beings, and at some level they realized that this inner evolution was able and ready for them to take conscious control of and participate in the evolution of themselves. And then we invariably see just a huge spike in the acceleration of their personal evolution. And then we see that their good works have propagated into the world, and that people, to a large degree, point back to these people and say, yes, it's true. That person's inner work bore these fruits and the cause and effect of it was that, yes, that person was born a normal person like I am. They saw the inner light, they saw the inner perception, they saw that they could take control and co-create themselves with the environment, and that they could oversee their own evolution. And then it accelerated, and then all those things that happened to them that they shared with people turned out they were good and they were effective. And it's proof that their inner process was a legitimate inner process, and that it wasn't just some sort of inner dialogue they were having of themselves that was delusional. The proof was in the pudding. They did the inner process, they accelerated, and then they shared. And people came back and said, yes, we agree with you. Your fruits were good. So it's kind of, I think that's a decent overview of evolution. Whether it's biological or spiritual, it's a process that life seems set up to focus us into. Life seems to be a catalyzing experience for evolution, whether it's in the physical, biological, Darwinian natural selection mode, or whether it's in the inner spiritual, self-guided mode. Of course, nature / infinite intelligence / God takes, is the overwatch in both. And and maybe we can see how the evolution of going from biological animals, going through a very slow motion, so to say, evolution, leads to the human version of evolution, because humans are animals. And maybe we went through the biological animal evolution to a point so that our biological traits had been naturally selected by nature, unbeknownst to us, to highlight our ability to then be ready and eligible to do the inner spiritual soul consciousness perception evolution. And that's where we're at now, that we are not separate from the biological evolution, but that the fact that we're the reward, or the aim, the goal of our biological evolution out of the animal realm, which we're still connected to, but like apart from them, our evolution was selected by our spiritual ability. And now that we're in this area, our natural selection and evolution is inner based and not externally based. So I think that's a decent overview on evolution. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner, and have fun.